All right, Jerry here. Welcome back to Canna Intel 420. Quick compliance note before anything else. This is strictly educational. Nothing here is instructing you to grow, sell, or operate outside your local regulations. If your state hasn't caught up, that's a legislative issue, not something this channel is navigating for you. There are no medical claims being made, no outcome guarantees, and no exaggerated promises. What you're getting here is analysis, grounded in observation, production realities, and how these products actually present in the market. Now, the reason this breakdown exists is simple. The industry continues to treat cultivar names as if they represent something fixed. They don't. A name on a jar suggests consistency. Same experience, same profile, same outcome. But once you start tracing that name back through how these products are actually produced, that assumption breaks down quickly. Genetic variation, phenotype selection, environmental inputs, and post-harvest handling all introduce divergence. By the time it reaches a shelf, that same label can represent materially different products. That gap between what the name implies and what the product actually is where most confusion starts. On one side, there's the intended design. That includes the genetic pairing, the traits being targeted, and the sensory profile the breeder was aiming to express. On the other side, there's execution, how that genetic framework was selected, cultivated, and finished. That process determines whether the original design is preserved, distorted, or lost entirely. This breakdown is built to track that full path. It starts with baseline identity, what the cultivar should present like when it's expressed correctly. Aromatics, structure, visual markers. From there, it moves into construction, why those specific parent lines were used and how their traits interact under selection pressure. Then it shifts into production reality, where variability enters, what drives it, and how to identify when something has drifted off target. The final step is application, taking all of that and turning it into something you can actually use in a real setting, standing in front of a product, assessing whether it aligns with its label, or whether you're looking at something misrepresented, poorly handled, or simply inconsistent with its intended profile. That's the objective here. No filler, no mythology, just taking the label at face value, and then testing whether it holds up under inspection. Mimosa Orange Punch is not a fixed product moving through the market under a consistent chemical or structural identity. It is a seed line released by Barney's Farm, built from Mimosa Evo and Orange Punch, and distributed primarily as feminized stock. That distinction defines everything that follows. What reaches the shelf is not a standardized output. It is a phenotype expressed within a genetic range. Any expectation placed on this name has to begin there, or it breaks immediately. The most consistent classification tied to this line places it at approximately 65% indica and 35% sativa. That ratio appears repeatedly across primary documentation, including U.S.-facing materials, and holds up as the most defensible structural description. Variations in labeling exist, but they tend to be secondary and less consistently supported. The correct entry point is not potency, and it is not effect language. It is sensory structure, what this cultivar is meant to communicate before any form of consumption enters the picture. That is where the available data actually aligns and where meaningful evaluation can begin. Across breeder documentation, the profile is anchored in a citrus-dominant confectionery direction. The repeated references center on sweet orange, mandarin, and candy-like characteristics. This is not a sharp citrus profile. There is no emphasis on rind bitterness, acidity, or volatile edge. The intended outcome is softened, citrus pushed towards sweetness, closer to candied orange or tangerine than anything resembling fresh peel. That distinction is not cosmetic. It sets the expectation for how the profile should read when it is expressed correctly. If the citrus presents harsh, sour, or chemically sharp, something in the chain, selection, cultivation, or post-harvest, has shifted away from the intended direction. The terpene structure cited by the breeder, limonene, beta-caryophyllene, and linalool, supports that framing. Limonene carries the primary citrus signal. Beta-caryophyllene introduces depth, preventing the profile from flattening into a single note. Linalool softens the overall output, adding a floral sweetness that rounds the sharper edges. The result, when those compounds are present in balanced expression, reads as sweet citrus with a layered, almost confectionery finish rather than an aggressive terpene spike. That said, this terpene framework should not be mistaken for consistency. These compounds may define the intended direction, but their ratios are not fixed across phenotypes or production runs. Environmental inputs, harvest timing, drying conditions, and storage all influence what ultimately presents. The only reliable takeaway is directional. This cultivar is built to express softened citrus with supporting sweetness, not volatility. Some descriptions introduce berry-like undertones beneath the citrus layer. Those should be treated as secondary at best. They may appear depending on selection and finishing, but they are not foundational to the identity. The primary signal remains citrus forward. Visually, this cultivar is positioned for immediate impact. Breeder descriptions consistently emphasize anthocyanin-driven purple coloration across the flower, contrasted against bright orange pistils and a dense layer of trichomes. That combination creates a high-contrast presentation, deep pigmentation, warm filament structure, and a reflective resin surface. This is not incidental, it is part of the design. The visual structure is built to stand out under retail conditions, where rapid assessment often favors contrast and surface reflectivity. The flowers are described as large, dense, and heavily resinous, reinforcing both perceived weight and quality. Anthocyanin expression, however, requires qualification. The genetic potential for purple pigmentation exists, but its expression is conditional. Temperature gradients, particularly during late-stage development, influence how strongly that coloration appears. Cooler conditions tend to enhance it, warmer conditions can suppress it. The deep purple imagery associated with this cultivar represents peak expression, not a guaranteed outcome. Trichome density, described as heavy, aligns with the expectation of a visibly frosted surface. These glandular structures are the primary sites of both cannabinoid and terpene production. When preservation is handled correctly, that density should translate into a noticeable aromatic presence without requiring agitation. There is also a necessary correction around potency framing. Breeder materials cite tetrahydrocannabinol levels reaching into the 30 to 32% range under optimal conditions. Those figures represent upper bound potential, not typical output. Independent laboratory data tells a different story. A documented sample labeled Mimosa Orange Punch #2 tested at approximately 23.165% total tetrahydrocannabinol and 27.694% total cannabinoids using high-performance liquid chromatography. That gap does not invalidate the cultivar's potential, but it establishes a boundary between marketed maximums and observed reality. This reinforces the correct analytical position. This is not a potency-driven cultivar. It is a sensory-driven one. Visual structure and aromatic composition define its identity, while potency remains variable depending on execution. Stripped down to what holds up under verification, Mimosa Orange Punch presents as a citrus-forward, candy-leaning hybrid line with a breeder-defined emphasis on sweet mandarin-type aromatics supported by limonene, beta-caryophyllene, and linalool. Its visual identity centers on high-contrast pigmentation, with purple anthocyanin expression, orange pistils, and dense trichome coverage. Its classification is most consistently supported at 65% indica and 35% sativa. Its potency range, while marketed aggressively, shows measurable variability in real-world conditions. That establishes the baseline. This cultivar is defined first by what it presents, structure and aroma, not by how it is marketed, and not by assumptions about how it should feel. Mimosa Orange Punch is not the result of casual pairing or aesthetic intuition. This is a controlled hybridization built around trait stacking, reinforcement, and outcome biasing. The lineage, Mimosa Evo crossed with Orange Punch, contains repeated genetic anchors that are deliberately carried through both sides of the cross to increase the likelihood of specific commercial traits presenting in the final population. To understand the purpose behind the cross, the parental structure has to be examined beyond naming. Mimosa Evo traces back to a combination of clementine and purple punch. Clementine, a Tangy-derived selection, is known for high limonene expression and a sharp, high-volatility citrus profile. The aromatics here sit in the upper range, immediate, bright, and easily perceived. This is the portion of the lineage responsible for the initial citrus impact. Purple Punch, on the other hand, contributes a different set of functions. It brings structural density, heavier calyx stacking, and the genetic potential for anthocyanin expression. Its terpene profile trends towards sweet, grape-like dessert-adjacent characteristics, which act to soften more aggressive aromatic components when combined. It does not compete with citrus, it moderates it. Mimosa Evo, taken on its own, is already a balancing system. It pairs volatility with density, brightness with softness. What it does not fully resolve is consistency, particularly in how sweetness and visual saturation present across phenotypes. That gap is where the second parent becomes relevant. Orange Punch is built from orange bud crossed with purple punch. Orange bud contributes a different type of citrus expression than clementine. It is less volatile, less sharp, and more rounded. The profile leans towards sweet orange rather than acidic tangerine. It lacks the aggressive terpene spike associated with Tangy-derived lines and instead produces a more stable, broadly acceptable aromatic output. Purple Punch appears again in this second parent. This is not incidental. It is reinforcement. By carrying Purple Punch through both sides of the lineage, the hybrid increases the probability of expressing the traits associated with that contributor. That includes denser flower structure, elevated resin production, and the potential for visible pigmentation. In breeding terms, this is line reinforcement, using a repeated genetic source to narrow variability in specific traits across a phenotype range. The citrus components, however, are not duplicated, they are layered. Mimosa Evo introduces a high-energy citrus profile driven by clementine. Orange Punch contributes a lower volatility, sweeter citrus expression through orange bud. These are not competing signals. They occupy different positions along the aromatic spectrum. The outcome is a stacked citrus profile. The sharper, more volatile compounds create immediate aromatic impact, while the sweeter, more stable compounds provide body and persistence. This interaction is what produces the candy orange characterization found in breeder descriptions. It is not the result of a single compound, but the interaction of multiple terpene sources with different volatility thresholds and sensory perception timing. From a breeding standpoint, this cross addresses three separate constraints. The first is terpene harshness versus consumer acceptance. Tangy-derived lines can express extremely sharp citrus that some users interpret as harsh or chemically aggressive. By introducing orange bud lineage, that edge is reduced and replaced with a smoother, sweeter profile that holds up better across a broader audience. The second is structural inconsistency. High citrus lines often produce looser flower formation, which is less favorable in commercial environments. Reinforcing Purple Punch across both parents increases the likelihood of denser, more uniform bud structure. The third is visual predictability. Anthocyanin expression creates differentiation at the retail level. By doubling the Purple Punch contribution, the probability of visible pigmentation increases across the phenotype range, even though environmental conditions still influence the final outcome. This is not random pairing, it is probability shaping. Parent selection is not based on strain names. It is based on observed phenotype within those lines. A Mimosa Evo selection used for breeding would have demonstrated strong citrus expression with acceptable structure and resin production. An Orange Punch selection would have contributed complementary traits, greater sweetness, improved density, and stronger visual expression. Those selected individuals are crossed to generate a seed population. What is released commercially is not a single fixed phenotype, but a stabilized range. The consumer is not interacting with a uniform output. They are interacting with a controlled spectrum. The repeated Purple Punch lineage narrows that spectrum in specific ways. It increases consistency in structure and visual traits while still allowing variation in terpene expression depending on which side of the lineage dominates in a given phenotype. At a functional level, this hybrid is designed to merge volatility with stability. The Mimosa side drives aromatic intensity. The Orange Punch side introduces sweetness and rounding. The duplicated purple punch lineage anchors both with density, resin production, and pigmentation potential. That is the logic behind the cross. Each component fills a defined role, and the final expression is the result of those roles interacting, not blending blindly, but converging with intent. The genetic framework establishes intent. It explains how the cultivar is built and what it is designed to express under controlled conditions. What it does not account for is what happens once that framework moves into production. At that point, expression is no longer theoretical. It becomes observable, and it starts to vary. The next step is to measure that variation directly, using real examples to determine where expression holds, where it shifts, and where it breaks. Before variation can be measured, a reference has to be defined. For Mimosa Orange Punch, that reference sits on 3 observable markers. Aromatically, it should lead with citrus, leaning towards sweet mandarin or candied orange rather than sharp rind or fuel. Visually, it should show contrast, pigmentation trending toward purple, offset by bright orange pistils and a visible resin layer. Structurally, it should present as dense, with surface reflectivity tied to trichome coverage rather than a flat or matte finish. That establishes the working baseline. From there, evaluation shifts to what actually appears in circulation, where identical labeling does not guarantee identical expression. The comparison holds to 3 variables only: aroma, morphology, and chemical output. The fastest way to assess alignment is sequential. Aroma comes first. If the front-end signal does not register as citrus, the evaluation stops there. Visual and structural traits cannot compensate for a terpene profile that falls outside the expected range. If the aroma aligns, the second pass moves to visual contrast and resin presence. This is not about matching breeder imagery. It is about confirming that the flower expresses some level of pigmentation variation and surface reflectivity consistent with trichome density. Structure confirms last. Density, calyx formation, and overall integrity determine whether the flower developed under conditions that support the intended outcome or drifted during production. With that framework in place, variation becomes measurable instead of subjective. In one retail instance, a product labeled Mimosa Orange Punch opens with a clear citrus signal. The aroma reads as sweet orange with a softened candy-like finish. There is no sulfur, no fuel, no sharpness. Visually, the flower shows moderate to heavy purple pigmentation, bright orange pistils, and consistent trichome coverage. Structurally, it holds density with a reflective surface. Comparable lab data places tetrahydrocannabinol in the low to mid-20s by percentage, with total cannabinoids approaching the high 20s. This aligns with a phenotype expressing both sides of the lineage, citrus layered with sweetness, supported by density and pigment. In this case, the product remains within expected range. A second example shifts within that range. The citrus signal is still present, but the sweetness drops out. The profile becomes sharper, more acidic, less rounded, with reduced depth. Linalool-associated softness is limited or absent. Visually, the flower trends greener, with reduced anthocyanin expression and lighter pistil contrast. Trichome coverage is present but less pronounced, flattening the surface appearance. This is still genetically consistent. Within a seed-derived population, not all phenotypes express traits equally. A phenotype leaning toward the mimosa side will push brighter citrus and reduced pigmentation, particularly if environmental conditions did not support anthocyanin accumulation. The identity holds, but the expression shifts. A third example breaks from that range. The product opens with a muted aromatic profile. Citrus is faint and lacks both brightness and sweetness. The dominant scent reads as generic plant material with light, earthy, or hay-like undertones. Visually, the flower appears dull, minimal pigmentation, subdued trichome presence, and reduced reflectivity. Structure may still hold density, but the surface no longer communicates resin quality. This is not a genetic issue. The primary driver is post-harvest degradation. Monoterpenes such as limonene are volatile and degrade under heat, light, oxygen exposure, and extended storage. In this condition, the cultivar may be genetically accurate, but its defining traits have been stripped to the point where the identity no longer presents. A fourth scenario introduces outright misalignment. A product labeled Mimosa Orange Punch presents with no citrus signal at all. Instead, the aroma carries fuel, garlic, or sharp chemical intensity. Visual structure may still show density and trichome coverage, but the aromatic direction is incompatible with the lineage. This is not variation, it is inconsistency. When the primary terpene direction is absent, the most likely explanations are misidentification, substitution, or renaming based on appearance rather than composition. Across these cases, the label remains constant while the underlying variables move. Aromatics range from sweet citrus to sharp citrus to degraded plant material to entirely different terpene classes. Visual presentation ranges from high contrast pigmentation to predominantly green. Chemical output reflects the same spread, with terpene presence and cannabinoid levels shifting depending on execution. These differences trace back to three mechanisms. Phenotype variation within a seed line introduces a controlled range of expression. Environmental conditions during cultivation, temperature, light intensity, nutrient balance, and harvest timing shape how those traits develop. Post-harvest handling determines whether those traits are preserved or degraded. When these factors combine with inconsistent naming practices, the result is fragmentation. The name Mimosa Orange Punch remains fixed, but what it represents changes depending on source, selection, and handling. At that point, the label stops functioning as a reliable identifier. Validation comes from alignment, whether aroma, structure, and visual presentation track with the known direction of the lineage. If that alignment is not present, the name alone carries no analytical value. What this shows is that the name alone does not define the outcome. The same label can represent aligned expression, partial expression, degradation, or complete inconsistency depending on how it was selected, grown, and handled. At that point, recognizing variation isn't enough. It has to be usable. The next step is to take what's been established and apply it, reducing it into a clear way to evaluate what's in front of you without relying on the label to do the work. When Mimosa Orange Punch is introduced at a professional level, the explanation does not begin with effects or percentage claims. It starts with what can be verified immediately: sensory structure and directional intent. The most accurate way to position it is as a citrus-driven hybrid built around layered expression. It should not register as a single-note orange. There should be progression. The front end carries a brighter citrus edge, closer to mandarin or tangerine, followed by a softer, sweeter body that settles into something resembling candied orange. That shift reflects how the lineage was constructed, combining a higher volatility citrus source with a more stable, rounded one. That sets the first threshold. If citrus is not present at the front, if the profile leans into fuel, garlic, or anything outside that range, the evaluation ends there. The product is not aligned with the intended expression. If the aroma clears that threshold, the second pass moves to visual confirmation. The cultivar is built with reinforced genetic influence that increases the likelihood of pigmentation, density, and resin presence. A properly expressed sample should show contrast, darker tones against lighter pistils, with a surface that reflects light due to trichome coverage. This is not an exact match requirement. Pigmentation is conditional. A greener sample does not invalidate the cultivar, but it does indicate a shift away from peak expression. The question is not whether it matches imagery, it is whether it still tracks with the expected range. Structure confirms last. Density, calyx formation, and surface integrity indicate whether the flower developed under conditions that support the intended outcome. Loose structure, dull surfaces, or compromised formation suggest drift during cultivation or handling. Once those 3 points are understood, aroma, visual contrast, structure, the rest becomes explanatory, not interpretive. Variation does not need to be guessed at, it can be traced. Differences in aroma often reflect phenotype selection within the seed population. Some expressions push brighter citrus, others carry more sweetness, others reduce aromatic complexity in favor of structure. Differences in appearance and intensity often trace back to environmental conditions. Temperature influences pigmentation, light intensity and plant stress affect terpene production. Harvest timing shifts both aromatic maturity and cannabinoid development. Breakdown in both aroma and visual quality points to post-harvest handling. Terpenes degrade under heat, light, and oxygen exposure. Improper drying removes volatile compounds. Poor curing prevents stabilization. Storage conditions flatten the final presentation. These are not abstract variables, they are visible in the finished product. That leads to the only clarification that matters. Mimosa Orange Punch is not verified by name, it is verified by alignment. If aroma, visual presentation, and structure track with the known direction of the cultivar, it sits within range. If one element shifts, the cause can be identified. If multiple elements fall out of alignment, the product no longer represents the cultivar in a meaningful way. This removes reliance on assumption. The evaluation stays grounded in what can be observed, not what is printed. The cultivar is understood as a defined range shaped by genetics, narrowed by selection, and altered by environment and handling. At that point, the label stops leading. The product either holds to its structure or it doesn't. Once you understand that, everything else changes. What this comes down to is straightforward, even if everything around it isn't. A name on a jar is not the cultivar, it's a reference. And if what's in front of you doesn't align with that reference, through aroma, structure, and overall expression, then the name has no functional value. Once you understand how a cultivar is constructed, what it's intended to express, and where that expression can break down, the way you move through the market changes. You stop relying on names and start relying on what you can actually observe. At that point, you're not guessing, you're evaluating. And when that shift happens, the market stops looking random. Patterns begin to show. What's consistent stands out. What's been handled correctly separates itself. And what's being carried by a name it hasn't earned becomes obvious. That's where real understanding sits. Not in percentages, not in hype, not in whatever happens to be trending. It sits in your ability to determine whether something holds up under scrutiny. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. It does not promote or encourage the use, sale, or cultivation where prohibited by law. Follow your local, state, and tribal regulations and act within those boundaries. All narration and sound design are original. No third-party music or licensed material is used. All right, this is Jerry with Canna Intel 420. Keep your standards tied to what you can verify, not what you're told. Stay focused on what's in front of you, not what's printed on it. Don't let a label do the thinking for you. Thanks for being here with me and building this channel. Later.